All right, it is 9:30, so we'll get started. I'm Seal Strauss. I'm the Minnesota State Floodplain Manager, working statewide with communities on floodplain management. And I'm joined by Gary. Gary, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name's Gary Bennett. I'm a hydrologist with the DNR's floodplain program, so I work closely with SEAL out of our central office in St. Paul.
Great. So we'll be co-presenting this. I'll be starting off and then Gary will start, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off at this point so we can save some bandwidth there. And we're talking about accessories, structures, and non-building structures in the floodplain today. So we will talk about small sheds and garages, those that are 576 square feet or less. And I know that's a weird number, but that's basically a 24 by 24 garage. That's based on what we would consider to be a two-car garage, and that's based on some FEMA guidance. The non-building structures, we'll be talking about a lot of different categories of things, including decks that are not part of a building, gazebos, stairs, fences, docks. Actually, the docks, we didn't have a separate slide about, so I'll mention that just docks that, especially if they're on rivers, if you're having permanent docks, you've got to look at whether it's causing a rise in the flood elevations. When we're talking about floodways, that's one of the concerns. And we don't have a slide talking about that, so I'll just mention that now, that can be a big issue on rivers. Retaining walls, solar arrays, swimming pools, there's all kinds of things that get built that aren't actually buildings, but they're structures that are in the floodplain that we need to be considering and regulating. And right off the bat, some of this is going to be repeat if you've listened to some of our other basic presentations recently. But one of the biggies that we always remind folks is that 44 CFR 60.3b, this is from the Federal Code of Federal Regulations. So it's the federal requirements. It talks about that all development needs a permit if it's within the zone A or AE, within the special flood hazard area on your community's floodplain maps. And the definition for development is very broad. It certainly includes buildings, but it includes any other types of structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, storage of equipment or materials. It's, again, very broad. Any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate. So that permit doesn't have to be a certain type of permit. If you've got building code and it's a building, you're going to issue a building permit. But communities, you might call it a land alteration permit or a zoning permit or a floodplain permit. Any of those is fine. You just need some kind of permit process. And if it's something you wouldn't normally require a permit for, you can consider waiving fees or having reduced fees for things that wouldn't normally require a permit in your community. Mentioned the buildings, and we're going to specifically be talking about the smaller sheds today. And I know that those of you with building code are used to saying, gee, if it's a small shed, if it's under 200 square feet or whatever that size is in the building code that says you don't need a permit, that exemption does not exist when we're talking about floodplain and floodplain regulations. Even those small buildings that would not require a building permit under the building code need a permit. And a lot of other non-building structures that we'll be talking about do need a permit. So basically that's the main thing. It needs a permit if it's in the map floodplain. So as part of our typical process is determining, is it in the map floodplain and what district is it in? Because that makes a big difference in terms of whether that building or structure is permittable and allowed to be in the floodplain and what the requirements will be. So we'll be talking about zones. So I wanted to just mention the different types of floodplain zones up front. The zone A's are basically the flood zones, the 100-year flood zones. And AE means it's got an elevation on the official FEMA map. On older maps, it had numbers. It didn't have the E. And then there's a couple categories of floodplain called AO zones, which is more of an overland flow, and AH zones, which are more like ponded areas where the AH will have an elevation on the FEMA map. AO will just have depths. We aren't going to get into details on these zones, but just be aware that there's different A types of zones. And then there's some A zones with nothing behind it, and that's where there might be some underlying supporting modeling or approximations of what the flood elevations are, but the base flood elevations, the flood elevations are not on the FEMA map. And we now will be having velocity zones or coastal zones in St. Louis as of March here in another couple months. Zone D is a place where the risk has not been determined, so it'll have a yellowish color on the FEMA maps, and we've just got a handful of counties where we have Zone D. Basically, it's showing that the risk isn't been determined, but there's no regulations for those areas. And the areas where we don't regulate, at least for the minimum standards, are shaded Zone X and unshaded Zone X, or Zone B and C on the older maps. So the main zones that we're talking about are the floodway and flood fringe, which is how we break out the detailed study areas. And then we've got an area in your ordinance that we call the general floodplain, and that's going to be those approximate Zone A's and the detailed Zone A's where they haven't mapped the floodway, and we'll be talking about the floodway. We are not going to talk today about coastal high hazard areas. That's just in St. Louis County, so we'll just talk with the staffs there when those questions come up.
See if I can interrupt you real briefly. There was a question
Sure.
in the chat related to your previous slide, and they asked, when you say within the map floodplain, does that include Zone X in the shoreline zone?
Interesting question. Yeah, the floodplain regs don't. The shoreline goes beyond the floodplain in the shoreline zone, and there's some of the requirements that apply. The minimum elevations for buildings apply in the shoreland, but some of the other details we'll be talking about here are specifically floodplain regs. And if we want to get into examples toward the end, we could talk about what things might be different outside of the floodplain, but within the shoreland district. So on the older maps, these zones, the dark shaded area is the Zone A or AE, and that's basically the 100-year floodplain where the minimum requirement is to regulate that area. And the medium risk areas, normally it's the 500-year, but it can be the 1%, the 100-year that's less than a foot deep or draining less than a square mile, or it can be areas that are protected by a community project that got accredited there. And then there's the low risk areas, the Zone X unshaded or the Zone C on the older maps. We're not regulating those areas, but there can be flood risk in those areas. And the floodway on these older maps is going to be this hatching that you see here. The flood fringe would be the area within the dark floodplain that is outside the floodway. On the newer maps, the coloring's a little different. The 100-year floodplain, the Zone A, is the light blue, with the floodway being this crosshatch, the hatched area with the red and blue. And again, the floodway is this area, and the flood fringe is that light blue area that's outside the floodway. The shaded Zone X is that medium risk area again, and the unshaded areas is the lower risk areas. So we're going to be again focusing on the floodway on both the old and new maps and the flood fringe. And I've already used a couple of the terms, but the frequency that we use for regulatory purposes is the 100-year or the 1% annual chance flood. They're in the detailed areas, they calculate other flood frequencies, but for the minimum requirements, we're talking about the 100-year or the 1% annual chance. And we do have different terms. I've already used a few of these, the 1% annual chance, the 100-year, base flood elevation is a term, or BFE, that FEMA uses a lot, and we'll talk about with the mapping here. Regional flood is what we call that in some of the Minnesota laws. Special flood hazard area is what we call the area when we're talking about the lending requirements and insurance. And in general, we'll call it the high flood risk area. So the first detailed maps that came out, they had a flood insurance study and they had a separate flood insurance rate map and floodway map. These are generally came out before '88. And more recent maps, they are combined. They put everything onto one map. Those older flood insurance studies tend to have this older, the people being rescued looking like they're wearing 1950s clothes here. But when the first digital maps came out before the 2010 and the 2000s, we had some of the counties start the map update process, becoming digital. Many of those counties, FEMA really just did a digital capture. You can see in this example here on the paper map, this weird shape for the floodplain. You can see that that's exactly what they put in the digital version of those maps. So when you look at it compared to the 2-foot elevation contours, you'll see that some of those early digital maps, the boundaries don't follow the contours very well. But as time went on, and those of you who got maps more recently, they use LiDAR, where the planes come and they shoot down light. They know how fast the speed of light is, and they're able to calculate really detailed ground elevations. And the more recent maps, their boundaries are following the elevation contours because they use that LiDAR to do a lot of the mapping and to draw the boundaries. And a reminder that in Minnesota, state law is that, well, your ordinance requires that you're regulating whatever's on the FEMA map. That's a FEMA minimum requirement. But state law says that if you're in an area adjacent to that mapped area and it's below the base flood elevation, that is regulated by your ordinance. So the person who's up high, they're still regulated because FEMA says we're regulating whatever on the maps, although they can get what's called a letter of map amendment that we talk about in other presentations. And this person here is low, so they won't be told that they have to get flood insurance at this time. They will when the maps get updated in the future and more accurately reflect the floodplain, but you still are regulating them because of our state law. And we do have that wording in here in our model ordinance, basically saying that if they're in areas adjacent to the map floodplain and they're below the base flood elevation, you're regulating them. So these newer maps, this is what the newer flood insurance study cover looks like. It doesn't have that 1950s graphic on it anymore. This is the look you'll see. And the coloring that I was showing earlier is the most current coloring symbology that FEMA uses on their maps. And the reminder that you do need to look at the datum, the reference to the elevations on the maps. On our older maps, they were using the 1929 datum. That's 29 datum is what most of our ordinary high water levels are in, and our lake level readings are in, because that's what was being used for many years. But more recently, we're using the 88 datum, the NAVD 88 datum. And the difference isn't such a big deal I saw Sean from La Crescent was on, for you guys, it's not a big deal, but you get up into the northwest part of the state, that's up to 1.4 foot difference. So that can be a big deal. The general floodplain is, again, that area where it doesn't have the area mapped, showing the details. So here's an example of zone A, doesn't have an E or anything behind the letter A, and it doesn't have any elevations in most cases, although I have seen in some of the more recent mapping, they actually showed that underlying supporting elevations on some of the lakes. But in general, FEMA maps won't show elevations on the maps. But we do have supporting modeling in more and more of our streams in the state, which is wonderful. In the last 5 to 10 years, we've done a lot of great modeling, and you've got supporting information. but you won't see that on the FEMA maps. You will see that on the DNR's Lake and Flood Elevations online map, and that's an example from our LFIO map. But one of the important things is that if we don't have a floodway, your ordinance, the way it's laid out, it says you treat everything as floodway until there's been an analysis or you've determined in some way that it's not the floodway, that is really the flood fringe. And we have a separate training dealing with zone A's where we get into some of those other techniques that beyond having an engineer do modeling to figure out where the floodway for this is the flood fringe is. But if you don't know, you're considering it floodway. And we do have a lot of the unnumbered A zones, approximate A zones throughout the state. The major rivers and major metro areas, we tend to have more of the detailed studies, but for many of you, you don't have detailed studies, so you don't know where the floodway is, and you have to consider those zone A's to be floodway. And so this is basically reiterating what I was just saying and noting when we've got the dealing with zone A's coming up. With lakes, though, we do have some language in our optional wording in our sample ordinance that says if it's on a more typical lake, then above the ordinary high can be considered flood fringe and below would be considered floodway, as long as you're not part of a flowing system and you're not near those tributaries. So here's a good example of a lake, and this looks like Lake Waconia, where most of the lake you're going to be able to say below the ordinary high is floodway, above the ordinary high is flood fringe. But here's a lake that is part of a flowing system, and that cannot be considered a lake for these purposes because that is part of a flowing system. Or in this example here, this is Medicine Lake, and most of the lake you can use that ordinary high above versus below for floodway versus flood fringe. But by the inlets and the outlets, those properties right by there, you've got to be looking at whether it's influenced by the flows there. But that does help much of the development that you're dealing with. So you've got that easier determination if that is flood fringe. The other reminder is sometimes we'll have detailed areas, zone AEs, but it won't show the floodway here. So again, that's got to be considered floodway unless you do some extra analysis to determine it's flood fringe, or you've got an engineer doing some modeling to determine where that floodway is. And this is where I turn it over to Gary, and he'll talk about why floodway versus flood fringe makes a difference.
Thank you, Seal. In continuing our discussion on the typical permitting process for accessory structures, I'm going to talk a little bit about the permit application and just making sure that you've got enough adequate information to do a thorough review. So just be aware that we do have a sample permit application available on the DNR's website. We actually have two versions. One's a simplified version. That's for non-building type development, and the other one is for those types of development that do involve a building. You're not required to use the DNR's permit application or sample permit application, but you should develop a permit application. In fact, your ordinance requires a permit application and includes some of the specifications and some of the information that is to be required to allow you to make an adequate an informed permit decision. And like I said, we do recommend using ours because it does cover all of the bases. It contains enough information to make that determination. Looking at a more close detailed look at our application, at the very top part, this is where we talk about the different flood zones, as well as the determination of the RFPE. Just please remember that when calculating the regulatory flood protection elevation or that RFPE, it is based on the base flood elevation. The RFPE is calculated as BFE plus your stage increase, which in Minnesota can be up to 1/2 foot plus 1 foot of freeboard. And this is just a reminder that the regulatory flood protection elevation is required for all structures. And for buildings, it's that top, the lowest floor, that walking surface that must be at or above the RFPE. Your ordinance, your floodplain management ordinance, includes a section that talks about development and the requirements that apply to all development within all floodplain districts. And these are, and this is right out of the Code of Federal Regulations as well as from state rule. And what we're showing here, we're not listing all of the actual requirements for all districts, but these are the highlights. So development must be adequately anchored. It must be constructed using flood-resistant materials below the regulatory flood protection elevation. It must provide for adequate drainage, such that it's not restricting that flood carrying capacity, not detrimental to adjoining areas. Again, those utilities are elevated, or in some cases, flood-proofed up to the RFPE. Your ordinance does prohibit the storage of materials that are flammable or likely to cause pollution. And lastly, development must be protected from erosion or include sediment control measures. Taking an additional look at the permit application. Again, this is DNR sample permit application, the portion that must be completed by the local zoning administrator. Looking at the middle part, it just echoes what we just talked about. Those requirements that are necessary for all floodplain development. And what we highlighted here are those that are more applicable to structures and buildings. So again, being adequately anchored, using flood-resistant materials, ensuring that those utilities are properly elevated above the RFPE, and things of that nature. And Seal may have touched on this, but just be aware that if those proposals, if your floodway development is actually proposed within the floodway, your ordinance does require that in addition to meeting the same standards of the flood fringe, it must, that application that you receive must include certification of no rise. And typically that certification of no rise is completed through a hydrologic and hydraulic analysis completed by a licensed engineer. We do have a Minnesota No-Rise certification form that's available for download and use on our website. We do recommend you use that. And lastly, be aware that if that hydrologic and hydraulic analysis shows that it's not meeting a no-rise, it's actually causing a rise, that development, before it can be constructed, must have an application and approval from FEMA for that conditional letter of map provision. Taking a additional look at our permit application on the bottom part here, it talks about those developments that are in the floodway, like we just talked about, and it basically it's a check for yourself to, is that proposal in the floodway? If it is, has the applicant provided adequate information to show that this is a no-rise? And if they have, was developed by a licensed engineer, or was it through alternative practices? And in such cases where alternative methods are used to determine no-rise, we definitely recommend that you vet those through the Department of Natural Resources to make sure that the methodology used is adequate. This slide, and I know Seal talked about this, the general floodplain district, where you've got those accessory structures, those buildings and sheds, garages, and things of that nature that are in a general floodplain district. Those are your Zone A and AE without a map floodway. Just be aware that your ordinance says you are to treat those areas as floodway until that flood fringe delineation has been completed. So again, new buildings and structures where that floodway has not been delineated may not be permitted unless the applicant provides certification from that engineer that actually has done the delineation process to determine that, yes, indeed, this is flood fringe.
I'll just mention specifically that in the areas with a floodway, the allowable rise is 0.00 feet, but as noted on the slide, if it's in a Zone A, we do have an allowable rise of up to 1/2 foot.
I think oftentimes that would be for other types of development encroachment, such as the placement of fill and things of that nature. But good point, Seal. Thank you. Last but not least, again, taking a more detailed look at the application. We do have a section on general floodplain district, and again, it's just a mental check, making sure that you've thoroughly looked at your application. And again, it's just talking about the general floodplain district. Has that delineation been done by an engineer to determine, is this flood fringe or is this floodway? Shifting gears a little bit, I just wanted to talk about FEMA's policy and guidance on accessory structure. I just want you to be aware that they do have this guidance. It's Bulletin P-2140. This is something that they had actually worked on during COVID. So in July 2020, they actually got a lot of these policies and guidance documents done during COVID. And we're not going to dive into this a whole lot, but they do define a building as having 2 or more rigid walls and a fully secured roof. The question often comes up, what is a rigid wall and a fully secured roof? And I think the basic definition is that, these are walls and roofs, they're not intended to automatically break away under flood pressures. I mean, they really are intended to be more a permanent fixed wall and a roof. Their guidance talks about accessory structures being small. FEMA says less than 600 square feet. Your ordinance says less than 576 square feet. That's an agreement that we've got with FEMA, so that they are of a minimal investment, not larger than 1-story, two-car garage, only used for parking and storage. And again, those examples include garages, storage sheds, and tool sheds. FEMA's guidance talks about structures that typically you might think these are accessory structures, but they are not actually accessory structures. And those are those that if any part of it is used for human habitation, such as a portion of it being used as an apartment, structures used for a place of employment, structures used for entertainment. So that includes workshops, rec rooms, game rooms, and of course, gazebos, pergolas, carports. These are not walled and roofed. So FEMA actually doesn't consider them a building. But please note that in your ordinance, in Minnesota DNR, in our state model ordinance, we do consider those structures that have fewer than 2 walls to be accessory structures, but we do treat them differently, so they are compliant with FEMA. The photographs on the right, the one on the top shows a building that clearly has habitable space above it, so that's not an accessory structure. Below, that's that top portion, likely not habitable, could be used for storage, but again, this is not a single storage building, and it certainly exceeds that 2-stall garage, so it's too large to be an accessory structure. Next, we're going to talk about permitted uses in the floodway and the flood fringe. We want to talk about the specific requirements for each. So for garages and sheds in the flood fringe, they are a permitted use. However, they must be elevated on fill. However, if elevated on fill, that 15-foot extension is not required, as it would be for a residential building. Or they may be elevated using alternative methods, dry flood proofed, or wet floodproofing are also options, again, only used for parking and limited storage. If they are internally wet floodproof, they must include those automatic flood vents. Again, all structures must be adequately anchored in the floodplain. They must use flood-resistant materials up to the RFPE. And any utilities they may have, such as electrical, which is probably the most common, but any utilities must be elevated to or above the RFPE. They are not allowed. These garages and sheds are not allowed in the floodway. And I guess just a general note, we see the asterisk in green, just a reminder, because sometimes communities forget this. If it's a general floodplain district, it's that zone A or AE without a floodway that must be treated as floodway until that floodway and flood fringe have been delineated by an engineer. So just an asterisk that you must make sure to do that step if it's general floodplain district before you do your permitting. Moving on to gazebos, binzebos, carports, picnic pavilions, and pergolas. And I know Seal has some photographs later in our presentation today. Again, these are permitted uses in the flood fringe. However, if these are designed with 2 or more rigid walls, we're going to treat these as though they are a garage and a shed. They're going to be considered a building, so they would have to meet those same requirements as a garage and shed, but typically they have fewer than 2 rigid walls. So under those circumstances, these types of structures would not be required to be elevated. However, they still must be adequately anchored. Again, flood-resistant materials below the RFPE, as well as utilities elevated above the RFPE. I do want to highlight that these are considered structures within the shoreline ordinance. So if your community does have a shoreline ordinance, be aware that they must meet setbacks and other shoreline requirements. They're not allowed in the bluff impact zone. However, they are allowed as water-oriented accessory structures to be as close as 10 feet from the OHW, provided they are not larger than 250 square feet in size. These gazebos and other examples are not allowed in the floodway. The only exception to that would be those open-sided accessory buildings that are accessory to a public open use standard. And the most common example that Seal gives is that picnic pavilion. It's a roofed building, but it's completely open-sided. That could be allowed in the floodway. However, an encroachment analysis to show that it meets that no rise at less than 0.00 foot rise would be necessary before you could issue that permit. Moving on to decks, another use that's allowed in the flood fringe. They must be adequately anchored. They must be constructed using flood-resistant materials. If they're attached to a building, such as a residential dwelling or a commercial property, again, they must meet those shoreline setbacks and other shoreline requirements. Another note that if they are attached, that any structural support member below the BFE, just something to take note of. If they're attached to that residential dwelling or commercial property and that structural support is below the base flood elevation, it will put the structure within the special flood hazard area for insurance purposes. So that's important to note. Also, decks, if they are in the floodway and attached to a building, remember that if they're attached to a building, they are essentially part of the building. So if attached to a residential dwelling, of course, we don't allow those types of buildings in the floodway. So if attached, they are not allowed in the floodway. If detached, again, they must show that encroachment analysis to show no rise and must meet your shoreline setbacks and other shoreline requirements. Switching gears to fences, another common type of project, non-building type development. And anyhow, these fences are allowable use or permitted use in the flood fringe. Your ordinance may make reference to a farm fence. I know state rule talks about farm fences being exempt from a permit, from your floodplain management permit. However, you must have that optional exemption language in your ordinance. Fences must not be detrimental to adjoining uses. They must provide adequate drainage and not restrict that flood carrying capacity. They must be adequately anchored and, again, flood resistant materials. When I say not detrimental to adjoining uses, what I mean is they're not diverting flow, basically negatively impacting a neighbor. Fences are allowed as a permitted use in the floodway, but again, you need to have that encroachment analysis to show that it meets a no rise. Also note that if an application is proposing a chain link fence, and no rise analysis, they're treating it as an obstruction. So even though we recognize that water can flow through there, when they're doing their analysis, they're treating this as though it is an obstruction to flow.
Okay, and Gary, Jessica was asking, is there a definition for narrow openings, either from DNR or examples from other folks? And I know that we'll talk specifically about chain link fences, that those are not big enough openings. Those do catch the debris, and chain link fences have to be treated as if they're a solid fence when you're doing the encroachment analysis. And we have talked actually with Jessica and other folks about some of the narrow areas. We don't have a specific definition in terms of inches, but that's something that would be good to get in the future, because we're getting some good examples from Edina and a few other communities of what is acceptable and isn't acceptable in terms of when you have to treat it as a solid barrier when you're doing that analysis of the impact in the floodway. And I don't know, Gary, you want to add anything to that?
I think you nailed it, Seal. I appreciate it. Next category is those solar panels, those solar arrays, and solar farms, becoming much more commonplace. I know a lot of communities are receiving proposals and applications to actually install those. And they are, again, a permitted use if it's located in the flood fringe. The guidance that we give is that solar panels, when they're fully tilted, that panel is at or above the RFPE. Also note that control panels, oftentimes you're going to have some kind of an electrical box or some kind of a control panel. Those must also be elevated at or above the RFPE. Of course, all development in the floodplain must be adequately anchored to prevent flotation and basically being carried away or becoming flood debris. They also must be constructed of flood-resistant materials. I don't think I mentioned this before, but FEMA does have a technical bulletin. I want to say technical bulletin 2 that actually provides additional information on what are flood-resistant materials. And roof-mounted solar panels. They are allowed on buildings that are located in the floodplain if the roof of that building and the connected utilities are at or above the regulatory flood protection elevation. Solar panels in the floodway are not allowed. And I think this might be the last category I was going to talk about, or I know we're getting close. Hoop buildings. And I know Seal has some photographs of these. These are those hoop buildings that are typically covered in plastic for garden centers and things like that you might see in the springtime. And these are a permitted use in the flood fringe if they are temporary. If they are temporary, they're actually exempt from permitting. So I shouldn't say they're a permitted use. They are actually exempt from permitting if they are temporary. However, you really have to do due diligence to verify that they actually are temporary, which may sometimes be difficult to do. Otherwise, if they're not temporary, they really must be treated as though they were a garage or a shed, and must meet all those requirements that we talked about before. So kind of an odd situation, but hoop buildings, yeah, can be difficult to permit. In the floodway, for obvious reasons, they are not allowed. Tanks. Here I'm specifically talking about outside tanks, like liquid storage tanks, fuel tanks, things of that nature. In the flood fringe, of course, they must be adequately anchored to prevent that flotation and lateral movement. Fill openings, vents, cleanouts, and outlets must be elevated above the RFP or designed to prevent entry of floodwater and the loss of the content. So that's probably the most common, is that they're just designed to be watertight and floodproof. Those tanks, if in the floodway, they're not allowed.
Valerie had asked about what is temporary, and I think that question came up during the hoop houses. And I would say, for instance, similar things to those hoop houses show up at garden centers or big box stores during the spring. They put them up for a month or so and they take them down. Those I'd consider temporary. Or if they're up for, your community has a weekend festival and they put up some temporary structures like that. Those are temporary, but pretty much if they're being used for ag purposes, they're generally not going to be considered temporary. It is kind of a, I know it when I see it kind of situation. And those are maybe examples of things that if you've got questions, that's a good one to reach out to your area hydro or me or Gary and get a second opinion, make sure we're all on the same wavelength.
Perfect. Cool. Thank you, Seal. And back to you,
Yep.
Seal.
Okay. So talking a little bit more with some pictures here, Gary focused on floodway versus flood fringe, which is a really important part of the decision. But here is an example of a garage, and we should be pointing out this was provided by Murray County, forgot to add that. And this is one where they do have their flood vents or openings. It's 576 square feet or less using the flood resistant materials. Here's a smaller shed. That's one that doesn't look like if it was in the floodplain, it's actually not, it's my neighbor's. But if it was in the floodplain, they would need to have the flood resistant materials, and this material isn't. And it would need their flood vents and to be well anchored. And this one isn't anchored because it's not actually supposed to be there. But here's another graphic that we like to use with those same concepts, that if it's less than the 576 square feet or less, which, as Gary mentioned, that's the size that FEMA negotiated with us. Our old ordinances, some of you may still have them, say 500 square feet, but we found out that Illinois was allowed to use 576 square feet based on a 24 by 24 garage, and we asked to get the same thing. So our model ordinance for quite a few years has used the 576. Anyway, adequately anchored. They've got the flood openings, they're less than a foot above the ground or less than a foot above the floor of the building. Any utilities, and for these sheds, it really should just be electric. If you're seeing plumbing and other things going in there, they're probably not just using it for parking and storage. Flood resistant materials. And they've got to be automatic. You can't be going and opening things up. And the reason for that is that when you get a flood and you've got the flood waters pressing against a wall, if it's all pressing on one side and you don't have an opening to allow the water to come in and equalize the pressure, then you get this result where the walls are caved in. And we've got plenty of pictures like this from past floods in Minnesota and around the country. And I saw a question pop up. Salt storage structures. Yeah, that's a good example that we should be adding that. And we would consider salt structures to be something that should not be below the RFPE, because salt is something that would be injurious to plants and animals during times of flooding. So, but that would be a good example to add. So as I mentioned, the openings, there's criteria on the opening sizes and that they not be too high up before you start getting that equalization of the pressure, that they need to be on at least two sides of the building. So if one side gets blocked by a bunch of debris, it can still equalize on the other side. And there's specific criteria on you need a square inch of opening for every square foot enclosed. So if you've got a 576 square foot garage, you need 576 square inches of net opening, subtracting any of the bars and obstructions that are there. A lot of times people do want to insulate those areas, so they will get these engineered openings. The typical engineered openings like this are the equivalent of 200 square inches of opening. And there is a guide giving you some information about what's the net opening in some of these other types of vents that you might put in there. Okay, we need a graphic that doesn't have the 15 foot of fill requirement for the accessory structures. And Gary added this since I last looked at the presentation, because we were taking our normal building and doctoring up that graphic. So if you're elevating on fill for these sheds, then you don't have the 15 foot of fill requirement. That's only for residential buildings, although it may be in some of your ordinances, because we just got that update in the last few years to clarify it's only required for residential buildings, so not for an accessory. When you're doing the review and analysis, again, you're looking at figuring out what those elevations are, determining what your regulatory flood protection elevation is, and then verifying that they built it that way. Some of our other structures, we were giving some examples, and again, all of these things need a permit, as we mentioned earlier. And that does include decks and gazebos and solar facilities and pools. And pools, in fact, I should mention that you're digging into the ground and they need to also be meeting the shoreline setbacks. Fences. Some of the other things that have come up that people have seen. Gazebos I hadn't heard of until Stearns County provided some pictures of those a few years ago. There are a few things that FEMA does have some guidance that says insignificant uses that will not create obstructions or have impact on flood flows, such as putting up a mailbox is coming straight out of the FEMA guidance 480. But and a flagpole is another example we would give. Or this is basically the size of a flagpole or mailbox on the bottom. So that wouldn't require a permit, but this is something that's actually in the floodway, and so they should be getting a permit for a non-building structure like this. Utilities, definitely want to be elevating those so that they're not damaged by floodwaters. Here's a couple great examples. This is one I know Nicole Lehman took by the Mississippi River. And Lucas Youngsma took this picture out in western Minnesota someplace. You can see that they've got nice anchoring on both of these, and you can see that the parts that could be damaged have been nicely elevated. So what's allowed in a floodway? Very limited situations where it is accessory to an open space. So again, the public park is our main example we'll give. Got to be anchored. Flood resistant materials, have your utilities that can be damaged by floodwaters elevated. This is the picture we've been using for a long time in our presentations, because we had this nice picture during a flood. This is like a 50-year flood at the time it happened. And you can see it's nicely anchored. They would have removed the picnic tables before the flood came through. And you do have to do the no rise certification if you're going to build that building. Decks and gazebos. They do require a permit. They need to require any local permit requirements you have, zoning requirements you have. They need to meet the setbacks and the size limits in your shoreline ordinance. So here's an example where that might be permittable. Some of these are definitely we had trouble finding good examples of decks because we had lots of examples of violations of decks that were not meeting the 10-foot setback or the maximum size to be a water-oriented accessory structure. Here's an example of a little gazebo during a flood. So it looks like it is nicely anchored. I don't know where this barrel came from. And this is the Benzebo examples that Stearns County was providing to us. So they are nicely anchored. This one, we're getting into the gray area of whether it's walled on two sides. And I know that when a similar picture like this showed up in a presentation FEMA was giving on accessory structures, the main guy doing the presentation kind of stopped and went, oh, yeah, I don't know about this one. That's got some partial walls. We need to talk about that in a little more detail. Fences, that's one that FEMA made sure that we added in our model ordinance in 2004, that fences need a permit. But when that got added, one of our first urban or rural counties said, well, wait a minute, farm fences, that seems kind of ridiculous that we've got to require a floodplain permit for farm fences. So we did negotiate with FEMA. We do have statutory definition of farm fences in Minnesota law. And so in your model ordinance, it does exempt your typical posts and barbed wire fences. That statutory definition does include some versions that are solid walls. And so the part we include in our exempt is just those that are these more typical things that you think of for farm fences. But if it's a chain link fence or a privacy fence, that's definitely an obstruction, definitely needs to be permitted. And if it's in the floodway, you've got to look at you've got to do a no-rise analysis. And as we were discussing a little earlier, the no-rise for these little openings you've got in a chain link fence, you've got to essentially consider that to be total obstruction. And we've been getting into discussions of how wide the openings need to be, that you can count them as openings. And that is something that we're still evolving on what the guidance is for that. But the reasoning is, here's a fence that's perpendicular to the flow. During the flood, the fence actually caught all this debris. The flow is going this way. If you zoom in, you can see a little bit better that that's all the debris that got caught in that fence, strong enough that it bent over. So it can divert water, and that is a concern. Solar facilities, they do need to meet shoreline setbacks. They do need to be outside the floodway. And we talk about that when these panels are tilted as far down as they can go, that they need to be meeting the RFPE, the regulatory flood protection elevation. I'm not seeing a control box here, but if you had a control, you'd want to make sure that that's above the RFPE also. We do have a separate document, and we will share these slides as PDFs so that you can look at the links that we've got in the slides later. So we do have a separate document that gets a lot more into some of the shoreland regulations, but briefly mentions some of the floodplain regulations toward the end. And we do have solar facilities mentioned in our quick guide on page 64, the quick guide, and cover some of these key situations that you need to be looking at. We also have a link to that same longer document that includes the shoreland guidance. And the tanks, the FEMA structure definition, specifically in addition to walled and roof buildings, talks about gas and liquid storage tanks. They need a permit, and if they're elevated, that's preferable so that they're above the RFPE. If they're lower, they've got to be nicely anchored because these can be buoyant, and if you don't have them well anchored, they're going to pop up. And along the same lines, you sometimes run into similar situations with cemeteries and with the caskets, that if they're not buried and anchored well, they will pop up. Or if you've got erosion problems, we've had places around the state where that's been, some of the old cemeteries have become an issue. And in Katrina, they had a lot of problems with their cemeteries. So moving on to pools. So this is an in-ground pool, definitely needs a permit in the floodplain, and we do have some guidance on that. And as I mentioned, if it's shoreland district, you need to meet the shoreland setback, because you're basically digging out like the foundation of a building, so it can have pretty big impacts in that shoreland area. This is something that is temporary that we consider to be not needing a permit, but I understand some local authorities will require some kind of a permit if there's a certain depth of water here. We do have a page in the quick guide talking about pools also, and some other things to think about, that if some of the ancillary things, the fencing, pool houses, that kind of stuff you need to be thinking about. Here's our hoop house. And if I remember correctly, Jean, I took this near your office there in Slayton, but that does need a permit. You can see that this is got some more permanent stuff going on here. So unless they can show it's temporary, it is going to be treated as if it's a shed or a building, and needs to be anchored and flood resistant and meet all those requirements. Inspections, as-built documentation is important. If it is one of those sheds, it's a building, we recommend using the FEMA elevation certificate. We do have the DNR elevation certificate, as-built certificate, that's got a few of our things that are unique, like low access point and the 15 feet of fill for the residential buildings, those kinds of things. If it is a building that's higher and it's clearly meeting, if it's like a shed that they're building, if it was a primary residence, I'd be less likely to go this direction. But if it is a building that's clearly high based on LiDAR, sometimes you can just use the LiDAR and photos of what they built and not require that they have a licensed surveyor come do a survey. I did do an article about this in one of the water talks, and this has a link to that article. So ending with a few of the resources here. As I mentioned, we will send a PDF of the slides so that you can link to the sites here that we're showing. And I think that's it. It is. So I think we've been answering the questions as we've been going. Gary, did you see any that I missed?
No additional questions in the chat.
Okay.